There is a particular kind of person you have almost certainly encountered at some point in your life. They do not shout at you. They do not insult you. They do not wish you obvious harm. On the contrary, they seem almost unbearably kind. When something goes wrong for you, they are the first to arrive with soft words and sorrowful eyes. They shake their heads with a kind of theatrical gravity. They say things like, "I just feel so bad for you," or "I cannot imagine how hard this must be," or "You poor thing." And somehow, inexplicably, you walk away from these conversations feeling worse than you did before they arrived. Not comforted, not strengthened, worse, smaller, more stuck. As though the very act of receiving their sympathy has quietly but firmly pressed you a little further down into whatever difficulty you were already in. Most people, when they notice this feeling, assume the problem is their own ingratitude. After all, this person meant well. They were being kind. What kind of person feels worse after being shown compassion? The answer, as Carl Gustav Jung observed with characteristic precision in his clinical work, is a person who has just received not compassion, but pity. And the difference between those two words, a difference most people treat as purely semantic, turns out to be one of the most psychologically consequential distinctions in all of human relating. Jung's warning about pity is one of the least discussed corners of his entire body of work. And it is, I would argue, one of the most urgently relevant to the way most of us actually live our lives today. Because pity is everywhere. It is in the way certain people respond to your struggles. It is in the way entire social media cultures have been constructed around the performance of shared suffering. It is in the specific kind of relationship dynamic that masquerades as support, while quietly ensuring that the person being supported never quite manages to stop needing it. And it is, Jung would insist, one of the most reliable routes available to the human psyche for remaining stuck, for being kept in precisely the condition from which part of you most wants to escape. This script is going to take Jung's warning seriously, which means we are going to go far deeper than the surface-level observation that pity feels patronizing. We are going to trace this idea back through the clinical foundations of Jung's own work, through Nietzsche's devastating philosophical analysis of pity as the most insidious form of power one person can exercise over another, through Dostoevsky's literary portraits of the damage done by a culture saturated in mutual suffering, and through the ancient mythological figures of the wound dresser who can never let the wound fully close. We are going to look at the specific, concrete way that pity operates in modern life, in families, in friendships, in professional relationships, and in the enormous collective arena of social media, where the performance of pity has become, for many people, a primary currency of social belonging. And we are going to walk through the specific practices Jung recommended for protecting your own psychic energy from the particular drain that chronic pity produces, and for distinguishing with real precision the relationships that are genuinely strengthening you from the ones that are keeping you exactly where you are by the end. The person with the sorrowful eyes and the soft words of sympathy will look quite different to you than they did before. Not necessarily as an enemy, but as someone carrying a very specific psychological dynamic that you now have the ability to see clearly and to protect yourself from, in a way that most people never quite manage. There is something additionally worth noting before we go further, which is that this warning applies not only to the pity we receive from others, but to the pity we extend to ourselves. Self-pity, which Jung considered one of the most reliably energy-depleting psychological states available to the human mind, operates by exactly the same mechanism as pity from others. It locates us in the position of the one to whom things happen rather than the one who acts, organizes our self-image around our wounds rather than our capacities, and ensures that the psychic energy that could be directing us forward is instead cycling continuously through the story of why forward is so difficult for someone like us. And it produces, in the interior landscape of the individual, the same comfortable, familiar stasis that chronic pity from others produces in the relational landscape. A kind of airless inner room in which nothing much changes because change would require relinquishing the one narrative that has been making sense of everything. The distinction Jung draws between pity and compassion is not a moral distinction. It is a structural one, rooted in where the energy flows between two people in an exchange that appears, on the surface, to be about the well-being of one of them. Compassion, in Jung's framework, is a psychologically active movement in which one person genuinely enters into the experience of another, feeling with them rather than merely feeling for them, and then, crucially, remaining a differentiated, distinct individual while doing so. A compassionate person can sit with your pain without being destroyed by it, can acknowledge the reality of your difficulty without collapsing into it, and most importantly, can hold in their own mind, even while fully present with your suffering, a clear sense that you are capable of more than this moment, that you have resources you may not yet be accessing, that this difficulty, however real, is not the final truth about who you are. Pity has an entirely different structure. In pity, the person observing the suffering locates themselves above the person suffering, looking down with a sorrowful benevolence that carries, embedded within it, a specific and usually unconscious verdict about the person below. That verdict goes something like this: you are someone to whom bad things happen, someone who cannot quite manage on their own, someone whose situation is, at some level, the natural result of who you are. The pity giver does not think this consciously, and would almost certainly deny it if asked directly. But the structural position that pity places them in, elevated, capable, feeling sorry for the one who is not, carries this verdict in its very form, regardless of the conscious intentions of the person delivering it. Jung observed in his clinical practice that patients chronically surrounded by pity tended to show a specific and recognizable pattern. Their symptoms persisted longer than equivalent patients with more challenging, less pitying support networks. Their capacity for self-initiated action was noticeably lower, and most strikingly, many of them showed a kind of quiet, often unconscious investment in remaining in the position of the pitied, because that position carried with it a specific and reliable form of social connection, a continuous supply of attention, concern, and relationship that would dry up the moment they actually recovered. Jung called this a secondary gain from illness. The unconscious incentive a person has to remain unwell because their illness has become, without their conscious awareness, the primary organizing principle of their social world. This observation connects directly to one of Jung's most foundational theoretical concepts, the compensation principle. For Jung, the psyche continuously seeks to balance itself, compensating for whatever is missing or suppressed in conscious life by producing its opposite in the unconscious. A person whose conscious life has become organized entirely around suffering and need will develop a compensatory, unconscious tendency toward exactly the opposite, a suppressed capacity for action, for self-sufficiency, for agency, that continues to exist beneath the surface, but that is never permitted to emerge, partly because the social environment built around pity has no place for it, and partly because the person has, over time, lost confidence in their own ability to access it. It is worth pausing here on the specific physical experience that this psychic suppression produces, because Jung was insistent that psychic dynamics do not remain neatly contained in the mind, but express themselves in the body. Many people chronically surrounded by pity describe a specific physical quality to that experience, a heaviness, a pressure in the chest or the shoulders, a faint but persistent difficulty breathing fully. Jung would read this somatic response as the body's registration of exactly the dynamic we are describing, the psyche being pressed steadily downward by the accumulated weight of others' verdicts about its capability. The life energy that wants to move forward being contained by a social environment that has organized itself, however lovingly, around the premise that forward is difficult or impossible for this particular person. Pity, in this framework, is not simply a passive, harmless expression of sympathy. It is an active, if unconscious, force that continuously reinforces the conditions that made it appropriate in the first place. This is where Jung's concept of participation mystique, which he borrowed from the anthropologist Lucien Levy-Bruhl, becomes directly relevant. Participation mystique describes a state of unconscious, undifferentiated psychological merging between two people or between a person and a group. A state in which the boundary between self and other becomes so permeable that the participants can no longer clearly distinguish where one ends and the other begins. Jung considered this state a regression to a more primitive, less psychologically differentiated mode of relating, one that is natural and expectable in early childhood, but that a healthy adult development should progressively move beyond. Chronic pity creates, between the pity giver and the receiver, a specific form of participation mystique organized around the receiver's suffering. The pity giver is not simply observing the other's pain from outside it. They are unconsciously, partly inhabiting it, their emotional life becoming entangled with the receiver's in a way that makes both parties' sense of the receiver's capability equally difficult to access. The pity giver cannot see the receiver's strength because they are too immersed in the receiver's wound. And the receiver, surrounded by this immersion, gradually loses their own access to a view of themselves that includes anything beyond the wound as well. Every expression of pity implicitly confirms the verdict that the person being pitied is genuinely too weak, too overwhelmed, too unfortunate to manage without help. And every confirmation of that verdict makes the next independent action slightly harder, the self-image of capability slightly more inaccessible, the position of the pitied slightly more entrenched. Over time, the relationship between the pity giver and the pity receiver can become a stable, mutually reinforcing system in which both parties, for different reasons, have a significant unconscious investment in maintaining exactly the dynamic that keeps the receiver stuck. Friedrich Nietzsche, whose influence on Jung was profound and whose own analysis of pity was one of the most systematically developed in the history of Western philosophy, went even further than Jung in naming the specific mechanism by which pity operates as a form of power. For Nietzsche, pity was not merely psychologically damaging to its recipient, but philosophically corrupt in its very structure, a sentiment that presents itself as concern for the other while actually serving the psychological needs of the person offering it. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche has his protagonist observe that pity makes the human being who feels it suffer more, while simultaneously multiplying and intensifying the suffering of the one being pitied, adding a second suffering to the first. The pity giver, in Nietzsche's analysis, does not actually reduce the suffering in the world. They reproduce it, amplify it, and crucially, make it their own property, a possession through which they can signal their own moral sensitivity, their own capacity for feeling, their own superiority to a world that does not feel as deeply as they do. Nietzsche was particularly savage about the specific social role that pity plays in group dynamics, observing that communities organized around shared pity develop a collective identity built on mutual confirmation of everyone's suffering and limitation. In such communities, anyone who begins to recover, to move forward, to exit the shared position of the pitied is experienced as a subtle betrayal of the group's fundamental identity, an implicit claim that the circumstances the group has organized itself around are in fact escapable, which threatens the entire social structure by suggesting that those who have not escaped might, at some level, have chosen not to. This dynamic, which Nietzsche saw as one of the primary mechanisms of what he called slave morality at the collective level, maps with disturbing precision onto specific social media communities organized around chronic illness, ongoing trauma, or perpetual struggle, where recovery stories, however genuinely inspiring to those outside the community, are sometimes met with a quietly hostile reception from those inside it. Nietzsche's concept of resentment, which we examined in detail in our earlier discussion of why you cannot say no, connects here with particular force. Pity, for Nietzsche, is one of the primary tools through which those who feel structurally powerless in life assert a specific, indirect form of power over those who appear, from the outside, more capable. To pity someone is to place yourself, however momentarily, in a position of relative elevation, a capable one, a fortunate one, the one moved by feeling rather than crushed by circumstance. This elevation is subtle enough that it never needs to be acknowledged consciously, and it is coded in such thoroughly positive moral language, kindness, compassion, sensitivity, that pointing it out feels almost unspeakably rude, which is precisely why it so rarely gets pointed out, and why the mechanism continues to operate so effectively in so many relationships. Arthur Schopenhauer, whose philosophy was deeply influenced by Buddhism, and whose concept of pity differed significantly from Nietzsche's, held that pity was in fact the foundation of all genuine morality, arguing that the suffering of another could be directly felt by a person whose ego boundaries were sufficiently dissolved. Nietzsche rejected this position vigorously, seeing it not as a foundation for morality, but as a celebration of weakness, a philosophy built around the dissolution of the strong individual ego into a collective soup of shared suffering that served nobody. Jung's position occupies a characteristically nuanced middle ground between these two extremes. He acknowledged the reality and the value of genuine compassion, understood as an emotionally engaged response to another's suffering, that nonetheless preserves the psychological integrity of both parties. But he shared Nietzsche's deep suspicion of pity as a chronic relational orientation, seeing it as inherently infantilizing to the person receiving it, and ultimately more about the emotional economy of the giver than the genuine well-being of the receiver. The specific Buddhist concept of karuna, often translated as compassion, but meaning more precisely the active wish for another's liberation from suffering, offers a useful contrast here. Karuna, in the Buddhist framework, is explicitly distinguished from its near enemy, what is sometimes called idiot compassion, a sentimental, indulgent form of sympathy that prioritizes the immediate emotional comfort of the suffering person over their genuine, long-term liberation from suffering. Idiot compassion gives the addict one more drink because they seem to really need it right now. Karuna, the genuine article, refuses the drink and tolerates the discomfort of the refusal because it is organized around the person's actual well-being rather than their immediate desire. This distinction maps almost exactly onto Jung's pity versus compassion distinction, and the Buddhist tradition's explicit naming of it as idiot compassion offers a usefully blunt vocabulary for a dynamic that Western culture tends to dress in far more flattering moral language. Dostoevsky, whose literary explorations of human psychology Jung admired enormously and whose novels read, in many ways, as extended case studies in the dynamics Jung would later describe clinically, returned obsessively to the damage done by a culture organized around mutual pity and shared suffering. The characters in his novels who are most deeply stuck, most thoroughly unable to move forward with their lives, are almost always surrounded by exactly the kind of soft, sorrowful, endlessly forgiving pity that presents itself as love. The underground man in Notes from Underground is pitied continuously, by himself and occasionally by others. And this chronic self-pity is, Dostoevsky makes clear, precisely the mechanism that ensures he will never change. Sonia in Crime and Punishment offers Raskolnikov something that begins as pity and must over the course of the novel, transform into something harder, more demanding, and ultimately more genuinely caring, a confrontation with his own responsibility, rather than a continuous indulgence of his self-perception as someone to whom circumstances, not choices, have brought this outcome. The myth of the wounded healer, which Jung discussed in considerable depth, and which occupies a central place in both shamanic traditions and in the later development of analytical psychology itself, offers a different and illuminating angle on this same dynamic. The wounded healer, in its original mythological form, is a figure who has been profoundly wounded and who, precisely because of their intimate knowledge of suffering, possesses a unique capacity to assist others through their own wounds. The crucial element of this mythology, the element that separates the genuine wounded healer from what we might call the wound dresser, is that the wounded healer's own wound has been, if not fully healed, at least fully confronted, worked with, and consciously integrated. They carry their wound, but their wound does not carry them. The wound dresser, by contrast, is a figure who has never fully confronted their own wound, and who, as a result, unconsciously seeks out other wounded people, not to help them heal, but to keep them company in wounding, creating a dynamic in which nobody actually moves toward recovery, because recovery would dissolve the shared identity that holds the relationship together. This distinction between the us, distinction between the other wounded healer and the wound dresser is one of the most clinically useful frameworks available for understanding the specific relationships in your life that present themselves as supportive but that seem mysteriously to correlate with periods of stagnation rather than growth. The wound dresser does not mean harm. They are not consciously keeping you stuck. They are doing something far more subtle and far more difficult to address directly. They are investing, without knowing it, in a version of you that needs them, because that version of you is what makes them feel useful, connected, and crucially, slightly elevated above their own unexamined wound. Jung encountered this pattern repeatedly in his clinical practice, describing cases in which a patient's primary support figure, often a spouse, a parent, or a devoted friend, would unconsciously undermine the patient's progress in subtle but consistent ways precisely at moments when genuine recovery seemed imminent. The sabotage was never overt, and the support figure was never consciously aware of it. It expressed itself in small, easily rationalized behaviors, arriving at moments of particular vulnerability with an intensity of concern that subtly reinforced the patient's self-image as fragile, introducing doubts about the wisdom of reducing reliance on the relationship, or simply being mysteriously unavailable, precisely at moments when the patient was beginning to demonstrate independent capability. Jung's therapeutic response in such cases typically involved working not only with the patient, but, where possible, with the support figure, helping them examine the unprocessed wound their own investment in the patient's illness was serving to keep safely at a distance. Modern social media has created, arguably for the first time in human history, a mechanism for scaling this dynamic to genuinely collective proportions. Platforms organized around emotional sharing and collective response have produced an environment in which the performance of suffering and this performance of pity toward that suffering have become among the most reliable routes available to individuals for generating the social connection, attention, and belonging that human beings need. A person who shares their pain in a particular way, through the right kind of language, the right kind of vulnerability, the right kind of visible struggle, will receive a rush of pity-coated responses, hearts and sad faces, and I am so sorry you are going through this, and you deserve so much better. That provides, in the short term, exactly the social warmth the person was seeking. But the structure of this exchange is worth examining carefully, because it carries within it precisely the Jungian pity dynamic at scale. The person responding with pity is elevated, moved, compassionate, capable. The person receiving the pity is, within the logic of the exchange, the one who is suffering, struggling, unable to manage, deserving of care. And crucially, the moment the suffering person actually recovers, actually moves forward, actually stops being in the position that generated the pity, the exchange that produced the warmth and connection no longer works. Recovery, in this system, is structurally costly. Not because anyone wants you to stay stuck, but because the currency you have been trading in requires your stuckness as the price of admission. This helps explain a phenomenon many people have noticed but rarely articulated clearly: the specific flatness or discomfort that can accompany genuine progress when the social world around you has been organized around your lack of progress. A related and increasingly common manifestation of this dynamic involves what might be called the vulnerability to pity pipeline, the specific sequence by which honest, courageous vulnerability, one of the genuine goods that certain online communities can provide, gets gradually converted through the mechanics of engagement and reward into a kind of chronic suffering performance that serves the pity-giving audience's need for emotional stimulation more than it serves the actual well-being of the person sharing. A person who begins sharing honestly about a genuine struggle will quickly learn, through the unmistakable feedback of increased engagement, heightened attention, and a warm flood of concerned responses, that suffering shared in a particular way generates a particular kind of social warmth. And the specific optimization pressure of platforms built around engagement metrics will, over time, push almost any honest narrative in the direction of whatever produces the most response, which in the domain of personal struggle is almost always the most dramatic, the most dire, the most irresolvable version of the story. Recovery, resolution, and forward movement generate, as a rule, considerably fewer likes than suffering, which means the structure of the platform itself quietly and continuously rewards the narrative of ongoing struggle and punishes the narrative of genuine change. When you lose the weight, leave the bad relationship, land the job you have been trying for, or recover from the illness that has been the organizing narrative of your social world, the response is not always the pure celebration you expected. There can be a subtle, barely perceptible shift in the warmth of certain relationships, a faint sense that something has changed in the dynamic, a new quietness where there was once a continuous stream of concerned attention. This is the social cost of exiting the pity position, and Jung's framework is one of the clearest available for understanding why it happens and what to make of it when it does. A concrete case study helps here. Consider a person who has been managing a chronic health condition for several years, a condition that has become, in that time, the central organizing narrative of their closest relationships. Friends check in regularly, family members rally around moments of difficulty, and a significant portion of their social media presence has become organized around honest, courageous sharing of the ongoing struggle. There is genuine warmth in this arrangement, genuine care, genuine community. But there is also, embedded within it, a subtle but real structural pressure toward stasis, because the condition and the struggle are what make the person legible to their social world, what make them someone others know how to relate to, what generate the continuous attention and care that has come to feel, if they are honest, like a primary source of belonging. When a new treatment begins working, when genuine improvement becomes undeniable, when the narrative of struggle begins to resolve, this person may notice something unexpected, not simply joy, but a complicated, disorienting grief for the version of themselves that the struggle made possible, and a quiet, often unspoken anxiety about whether the warmth they have been receiving will survive the recovery that was. Ostensibly, the whole point. This is not a criticism of the person in this situation. It is an illustration of the Jungian insight that pity, however well-intentioned, creates psychic conditions that are structurally opposed to the recovery it ostensibly wants. A second, different kind of case study illuminates the dynamic from another angle. Consider two people who both lose a job in the same month. The first person is surrounded by friends and family who respond with continuous, warm concern, who ask daily how they are managing, who offer constant reassurance about how difficult the situation must be, and who subtly, without intending to, confirm through the texture of their attention that this is indeed a genuine catastrophe requiring significant ongoing support. The second person's support network responds with immediate, practical engagement, asking what kind of work they are interested in, connecting them with contacts, treating the situation as a challenge to be solved rather than a wound to nurse. Research on unemployment and psychological recovery consistently finds that the second type of support produces dramatically better outcomes. Faster reemployment, higher emotional well-being during the interim period, and significantly lower rates of chronic, extended difficulty. Not because the first network cared less, but because the specific structure of the care they offered continuously confirmed the verdict that the situation was fundamentally beyond the person's control, while the second network's equally warm engagement continuously confirmed the opposite. And it is an illustration of why Jung considered the cultivation of genuine compassion, as opposed to pity, one of the most demanding and most important psychological tasks available to anyone who wishes to genuinely support another person through difficulty. So what does genuine compassion, as opposed to pity, actually look like in practice? The distinction, which is easier to describe than to execute, comes down to the specific implicit message the support carries. Pity, as we have established, carries the implicit message: you are someone this has happened to. You are in a difficult position from which you may or may not emerge. And I am moved by your difficulty from my position of relative capability. Genuine compassion carries a structurally different message. I see your difficulty fully. I am with you in it completely. And I also see, and continue to hold in my mind, a version of you that is capable of moving through this. Not because I am rushing you, but because I refuse to let my care for you collapse into a vision of you that consists only of your current struggle. The practical difference shows up in the language. Pity says things like, you poor thing. I cannot imagine how hard this is. You have been through so much. Statements that locate the person fully inside their difficulty and implicitly suggest that the difficulty is the primary truth about who they are. Genuine compassion says things like, this is genuinely hard, and I am with you in it. What do you need right now? I know you, and I know you can find your way through this. Statements that acknowledge the reality of the struggle without making the struggle the permanent identity of the person in it. This distinction is, I want to acknowledge, genuinely difficult to maintain consistently, particularly when someone you love is in real pain and the instinct toward soft words and sorrowful presence is immediate and powerful. Jung was not suggesting that people in difficulty should be denied comfort, or that emotional support should be withheld until it can be guaranteed to be perfectly structured. He was suggesting something more subtle and more demanding, that the most genuinely helpful thing you can do for another person is to hold both their current suffering and their future capability in mind simultaneously, never allowing your concern for the first to erase your faith in the second. The first practice for protecting your own psychic energy from pity-based relationships is what might be called a relationship audit. A deliberate, honest examination of which relationships in your life consistently leave you feeling more capable and more like yourself after spending time in them, and which ones, however warm, however full of apparent concern, consistently leave you feeling somehow smaller, more limited, or more defined by your difficulties. This audit is not about blaming anyone or ending relationships that contain genuine warmth. It is about developing a clearer, more honest picture of the actual psychic effect different relationships are having on you, separate from their surface-level emotional tone. A useful concrete exercise here is to track, over several weeks, your energy level before and after specific interactions with the key people in your life. Not your mood during the interaction, since pity-based interactions can feel genuinely warm and connecting in the moment, but your felt sense of your own capability and forward momentum in the hours following them. The person whose company consistently leaves you feeling slightly more capable, slightly more like the best version of yourself, is almost certainly offering you something closer to genuine compassion. The person whose company consistently leaves you feeling slightly more burdened, slightly more defined by your difficulties, is almost certainly, however warmly they express their concern, offering you something closer to pity. This distinction, tracked honestly over time, tends to become remarkably clear. The second practice is specifically Jungian in its approach, using active imagination to examine the implicit messages you have been receiving about your own capability. In a quiet moment, recall a recent interaction in which you received what felt like pity rather than genuine support, and ask yourself, honestly and without censorship, what verdict about you was embedded in that interaction? Not the conscious, surface intention of the person offering it, but the structural message their response carried about who you are and what you are capable of. Allowing this question to surface and following it wherever it leads often reveals a surprisingly clear picture of the specific ways in which pity, accumulated over time and across multiple relationships, has been quietly shaping your self-perception. The third practice is one of the oldest and most consistently validated techniques in Jung's clinical toolkit, the deliberate cultivation of what he called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to hold two apparently contradictory truths simultaneously without forcing a premature resolution. In practical terms, applied to the pity dynamic, this means developing the capacity to fully acknowledge the reality and the difficulty of your current situation, without allowing that acknowledgement to become the whole story of who you are. I am genuinely struggling with this right now, and I am also genuinely capable of things this moment does not yet reflect. Both of these statements can be true at the same time, and maintaining access to both simultaneously, rather than collapsing entirely into either the suffering or the defensive performance of capability, is what the transcendent function makes possible. A practical exercise for developing this capacity is what might be called the dual truth practice. When you find yourself in a period of genuine difficulty, make a deliberate habit of completing 2 sentences every morning. The first sentence begins with the words, "Right now, I am genuinely struggling with," and is followed by whatever is honestly true for you in the present moment, without minimizing it or performing a more manageable version of it than actually exists. The second sentence begins with the words, "And I am also genuinely someone who," and is followed by a real specific capability, value, or quality that the present difficulty may be obscuring, but that continues to exist underneath it. This practice does not minimize suffering, and it does not demand premature optimism. What it does is continuously resist the totalizing movement by which difficulty becomes identity, holding open, through deliberate daily practice, the psychological space in which recovery, when it comes, has somewhere to land. The fourth practice involves a conscious reevaluation of how you yourself offer support to others, particularly those you love. Since most people who have internalized a pity-based relational model have done so partly by being on the receiving end of it, they have often, without realizing it, also learned to extend it. Examining the specific language and the specific energetic structure of your own supportive responses to others in difficulty. Asking honestly whether your support carries the implicit message of their capability or the implicit message of their deficiency, can reveal patterns that are both personally illuminating and practically useful for changing the quality of care you are able to offer. The fifth practice, and in many ways the most fundamental, is shadow work directed specifically at your own relationship to suffering. Many people who find themselves chronically in the pitied position, or who find themselves chronically offering pity to others, carry in their shadow a specific unexplored relationship to their own wounds, a set of experiences they have never fully integrated, but that continue to shape their relational patterns from below the surface of consciousness. Jung's insight, developed most fully in his work on the wounded healer, was that the wounds we have not yet confronted directly are precisely the ones that most reliably structure our relationships with others around the same dynamic that produced them. Bringing those wounds into conscious examination, through journaling, through active imagination, through dream work, or through genuine therapeutic engagement, is not simply a private individual process. It is also, and in some ways more importantly, the specific work that makes it possible to offer others the kind of support that actually helps them forward, rather than the kind that, however warmly intended, quietly ensures that nobody moves anywhere at all. The sixth and final practice involves developing what we might call immunity to the social pity marketplace, the ability to participate in communities built around shared vulnerability without losing yourself in the specific dynamic we have been describing. This requires a specific kind of discernment, the ability to distinguish between honest, courageous sharing of struggle that invites genuine witness without demanding pity, and the specific performance of suffering that is structured to produce pity as its primary output. Both exist online and in person. Both can feel, from the outside, very similar. The difference lies in the energetic direction of the exchange, whether it is oriented toward eventual movement and recovery, or whether it is organized, consciously or not, around remaining in the position that the sympathy requires. So why did Jung consider pity more dangerous than hate? Because hate, whatever its other considerable deficiencies, at least has the virtue of locating you on equal or opposing ground. Hate says you are something to be reckoned with, something worth opposing, something with enough power and presence that an active response is required. Pity says something considerably more damaging. You are something to be felt sorry for, something insufficient, something whose struggle is, at some level, the expected outcome of who you are. Hate can, paradoxically, activate the fighting spirit. Pity, chronic and pervasive, quietly extinguishes it. One sorrowful look and one sad shake of the head at a time, until the person on the receiving end has gradually internalized the verdict embedded in all those soft words and begun, without quite knowing how it happened, to see themselves entirely through the eyes of the person looking down at them. There is a specific and irreplaceable dignity available to those who refuse this position, not by refusing the reality of their own difficulty, and not by performing a brittle, unconvincing cheerfulness that denies what is real, but by insisting, in the face of every sorrowful gaze and every well-intentioned poor thing, on a version of themselves that contains more than the current moment allows others to see. By accepting genuine support, the kind that holds both your present reality and your future capabilities simultaneously, and declining, gently but firmly, the kind that only holds the first. And by extending to others, in their own moments of difficulty, not the soft, elevated gaze of pity, but the harder, more demanding, ultimately more respectful gift of genuine compassion, which sees the person fully, sits with them honestly, and never once stops believing that they are capable of something the present difficulty temporarily obscures.